we are ready for part 2. So I've written 4 paragraphs trying to account for the 4 different plays that I quoted from. Incidentally, I could have picked quotes from practically every other play and have worked on them, because really Shakespeare is very concerned with his own acting. There are so many plays that have an element of acting as part of their plot. Characters acting as other characters, setting up plays for other characters. Framing, yeah. It's just the meta, the self-reflexive, the talking about what you're doing as you're doing it element of Shakespeare's theater is super strong. Alright, so I went with one of the moves I taught you, which is at first it seems one way, and then we see, looking closely, that it actually does something else as well, or even more immediately. So here's that move. Seemingly, we have in Macbeth's reaction to his wife a theatrical metaphor for despair, wherein life is but a poor player that mutters its lines without much meaning, like a lost psyche, signifying nothing. Sure. Cool. I don't actually think this is such a bad reading. It's just not... there's not much originality there. I think that's pretty much what most audiences would get. Just Macbeth's actual sense of despair. It actually doesn't make as much sense of she should have died hereafter and the rest of that speech tone, but never mind. Maybe he progresses in his despair as the speech goes on. But, and regardless, he is getting more and more insane, so that makes sense. But there's something deeper going on, in my opinion. So let's go on. This is certainly a good metaphor for Macbeth's increasing madness, but the choice of an acting metaphor directs us elsewhere. So we are going deeper, elsewhere, towards a comment on Shakespeare's art itself. It is, after all, not only Macbeth who is morally lost in his ungrieving response to tragedy, but the play itself, whose very essence as a tragedy depends on deriving meaning from death. So in a sense, we're seeing here Macbeth reacting to his wife's death is the chance for us to get that experience of tragedy translated on stage for us. And he just says, yeah, it's nothing. Just a lot of sound and fury. Should have happened another time. Just one of the most frustratingly self-critical and disappointing responses to death on any level. And I think that's part of what makes that speech so amazing. It's just, yeah, I have nothing. Fury signifying nothing. Alright, to say that the Macbeth's lives have been a tale of sound and fury signifying nothing, then, is to suggest the play may have failed in producing the tragic effect its audience would expect. Thus, through Macbeth's loss for words and meaning, Shakespeare is in effect suggesting a critique of his own playwriting, which I could have continued on and on to explain and elaborate because it's a complicated point. But you see the move, generally speaking. Macbeth saying life like a theater is inconsequential, like a failing theater act is inconsequential. And Shakespeare's putting that in a theatrical act suggests, maybe this is not as meaningful as one would hope. It's possible. And I don't have anything. Reminds me of something, if I'm allowed a tangent, it reminds me of something that Stephen King has a character say where, in one of his most significant novels, to him, a character tells another character? What does it all mean? And the character says, I don't know. And Stephen King narrates this scene as having taken him 3 months to write, between the what does this mean and the I don't know. And the way he could not really come up with an answer that satisfied him, so that he's left with uncertainty, so his character is left with uncertainty. There's something of that to Macbeth's tale of fire and fury. Fire and fury. I'm too invested in modern politics at the moment. Alright, second example. Romeo here seems to unconsciously parody the paradoxes of conventional Petrarchan poetry. But then with his self-aware question, dost thou not laugh, Romeo shows that he is in on the joke that sets him as the punchline. At first, it seems the purpose of this is to show Romeo's surprising maturity when he... Sorry, there will always be typos, you know this. When he is at his most sentimental, but considering the fact that the likely reaction of the audience to such patent parody would be to laugh, the question becomes a question of Shakespeare's own theatrical style. Here, I'm changing this to a period. If you are like me and you're risking writing way too long a sentence at every turn, you may want to rethink it and add some periods. But I think most students have the opposite problem. It is as if, through Romeo's question, Shakespeare is directing his audience to appreciate the comedy. Then again, if Benvolio stands in for the audience. So again, the move is, Romeo is asking, don't you find my own absurdity funny? Do you not laugh? And Shakespeare is saying, isn't this funny? Isn't this funny? And it's kind of saying, okay, yeah, I know, this is a parody. I'm aware, it's not just Romeo who's aware. I want you to be aware that I'm aware. I'm not just accidentally creating a character who is just an absurd exaggeration of all the things we would make fun of in Petrarchan poetry. I'm purposefully doing this. So, do not laugh? Isn't this funny? But then the reaction says, it's not funny. And there's something tragic on Romeo's part here, and there's something tragic on Shakespeare's part. Because Benvolio, if he's our audience's response, his response that he would rather weep suggests a failure of the parody. Shakespeare's gone to great trouble to exaggerate and ridicule Petrarchan convention, but he does not imagine that his audience will find it funny. On the contrary, alerting us to the joke seems only to make things worse. I don't know that I agree with this argument that I've made, but I think that's part of the richness of the play, is Romeo, there's something really clever that Shakespeare is doing, which is Romeo's making he's making a mockery, he's making a fool of himself. Then Shakespeare's saying, okay, but his saving grace is he at least knows that he's making a fool of himself. He's not so silly that he doesn't know that he's silly. But then, even making a fool of himself isn't funny. So the whole, it seems so pointless in some ways. So there's part of the tragedy there, and again, it goes back to the problem of, I could have written for ages about how this talks about the problem of parody, and the problem of no matter how much awareness you bring to parody, there's the risk that the audience won't get the joke, that the audience will not sympathize with the joke. I actually think Benvolio finds that even though Romeo has turned all of his pain into this hyper-stylized poetry, he still sees all the pain there. So the parody doesn't help Benvolio think of Romeo's pain as a joke, even though Romeo, to some degree, is making it a joke, and is aware that his own reaction is a joke. So the joke fails on a lot of levels, and part of it is that we are asked to react a certain way, and we may well not. We may well not. I think that's the risk of parody in general. It's hard to predict your audience's reaction to exaggeration. Are they even going to know that you're exaggerating? Even if they do know that you're exaggerating, does that actually trump what you're exaggerating? Or does the thing that you're exaggerating, the pain of unrequited love, trump that exaggeration? Okay, so on to the third scene. There's much absurdity to this ahistorical scene of Richard II, wherein a father exposes his son's betrayal of the king within seconds of that son's own confession, and but seconds before his wife emerges to plead for her son's life. The whole thing is more ridiculously structured than I can possibly spell out. This is my summary of it. And the thing is, Shakespeare really wanted to do something. He really wanted to show Henry's compassion in some ways. He really wanted to create this family drama, and there's like religious undertones of the son being forgiven, and all sorts of parallels with Richard II's response to a request for mercy. There are a lot of things the scene accomplishes. A realistic probability model is not one of them. The audience thinking, yeah, this is probably how it happened, this is not one of the things the scene can possibly accomplish. On a lot of levels. So, in a way, Shakespeare was faced with the problem of, okay, what do I do here? I've written this scene, it does a lot of things that I want, it doesn't achieve the probability, it doesn't sound as real as all my other scenes, or most of my other scenes. What do I do? One of the solutions is, okay, let's own up to it. When you make a mistake, or when you do something that isn't perfect, you can pretend that you just did it right, or you can just say, this sounds like, here's King Henry's line. Like, he refuses to take himself seriously, it's amazing. Our scene is altered from a serious thing. Oh gosh. My laptop is altered from a serious thing to a broken machine. Our scene is altered from a serious thing and now changed to the beggar and the king. This is so callous as a remark to a woman begging for her son's life, but as a comment about the play, it makes a lot more sense. Just to say, yeah, I know this is ridiculous. I know. I'm with you, audience. You'll find that great writers know when they're doing something weird. Okay. In fact, it seems the absurdity has weighed a little heavily on Shakespeare, doing something very dangerous of going into Shakespeare's mind. So I've done it seems rather than if I said the absurdity had weighed heavily on Shakespeare, this would be horrible, 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 me mind-reading Shakespeare. My God, is that boastful of me, and would that be incorrect of me? But it seemed it weighed, and then again I say a little heavily. Why a little and not just heavily? Because I'm on dicey ground, and so the less confident, the less boastful I sound, the better. A little heavily on Shakespeare. As he has King Henry himself comment at the height of the political drama on the theatrical improbability of the scene. Our scene is altered from a serious thing and now changed to the beggar and the king. As a reaction to his own aunt's misery and her son's potential execution, Henry's reaction seems at best callous, at worst monstrously cruel. But the theatrical phrasing suggests this is less Henry's comment and more of a breaking of the theater's fourth wall, allowing audiences to note the farcical nature of the scene, and perhaps laugh at a moment where they might otherwise cry. Okay, so it gives you also something of a comedic turn. It almost tells you how the scene will resolve itself, which is he's probably not going to execute her son. He's not. But he wouldn't after admitting that this is a farce. Basically saying this is a bit of a farce limits the consequences as well. So there's also something there. The functions of this aside are really beautiful. Alright, Prospero's turn here. The turn from, I'm gonna get these two people to marry, my daughter and this perfectly eligible gentleman that I've shipwrecked on the island for the exact purpose of this. I'm gonna get them to marry each other. Well, maybe that'll be too quick. Gotta give them a chance to really develop feelings and not take each other for granted. Okay, so that turn seems at the very least strange, if not outright illogical. Having accomplished his son of bringing his daughter together with Ferdinand, he suddenly makes an about-face because his plan worked? I should add too quickly? His explanation that the lovers would take their love for granted if it is too lightly won. You remember the brackets that say this is the same quote, but I'm changing the grammar to make it sound. Anyway, is hardly convincing. He mentioned no need for passing Ferdinand through an obstacle course when he initially conceived of the plan. And besides, such a delay tactic seems to be too great a risk for a father who just secured his daughter the perfect match. You just don't see anyone doing this. So, as human psychology, then, this makes little sense. But as a comment on Shakespeare's theater, it is far more reasonable. I think this is the best of metacriticism. It's when a character says something and it really doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense for Henry to say what he's saying. Doesn't make sense for Prospero to say what he's saying. Doesn't make sense to some degree for Romeo to say, are you not even laughing at me? Are you not laughing at me? Even this is dubious. Like, you have to be some mature gentleman, and we know that Romeo is not that mature. So, to come in and say, you know what, this doesn't make sense because that's not what it's about, that's the best thing a critic can do. Make sense of something that otherwise doesn't make sense. Okay, so it's much more reasonable. As a comedy, the play must end with the lovers' marriage, which simply cannot be guaranteed by the end of the second scene. This is scene 2 of Act 1. Would be the most ridiculous play, the most ridiculous comedy, if the couple married. On the contrary, I think one of them would have to, it's much more likely to be setting the play up for a tragic downfall if the marriage is accomplished like that. So, it's a self-reflexive remark, which is the terminology for a remark on your own art, on the thing you're doing, on the necessities of the theater to build up suspense and throw obstacles in the lover's way. Don't know why I said ways. Interestingly, Shakespeare is not only showing us the narrative problem of an easily resolved love plot, but he is giving us a reason for plot itself. So that's another cool thing with meta-commentary. You can start thinking about, okay, what does this tell me about plot? What has he told us about farce in the earlier scene? It's basically told us when a scene is too improbable, it turns into a farce. Could have gone that route. Or he tells us parody risks being misunderstood or not being funny because it's still exaggerating something that is pretty miserable. Otherwise it wouldn't be ridiculing it. So he is telling us something about parody, about the theater. What's the great risk of the tragedy of Macbeth? It's not that people are dying, but much worse, that we will not derive any meaning from their death. Their death is actually necessary for the tragedy. We want them dead. We went to see a tragedy. We expect some blood. But we don't want that blood to be signifying nothing. That is just a lot of pain and no gain. That is probably the greatest fear of the playwright, articulated in those lines in some ways. Okay. Alright. So it is not simply a matter of passing the theater goer's time for as long as possible, but a way of giving them an appreciation for the meaning of the resolution. So it's not just the lover that's being tested, it's the audience that gets to experience the lover developing. A way to earn the ending, as it were. Plots, Prospero and Shakespeare are showing us here. This is a nifty little move, where you're kind of, through grammar, character and Shakespeare, you're basically saying that Shakespeare is using this character as a mouthpiece. Which I think he is. But if you feel insecure, you could change showing us to suggesting, or might be suggesting if you're feeling very insecure. More than a pragmatic necessity, they're a way of allowing characters to develop and prove themselves worthy of their just rewards. So it's not just that comedy lasts this long because you need to be in the theater for a couple of hours. Wouldn't make sense for you to be in the theater for 10 minutes. It's also that for the joy of marriage and reconciliation and the world coming together and all that good stuff to mean something, you have to actually experience the challenges of that. Whereas, as a comment about human nature, I don't know that this works. Especially not coming from Prospero. It definitely works when Juliet makes a very similar comment about Romeo's love, where she's like, this love is like lightning. You might very easily burn out. And because she's the object of the love, she's very concerned. He is concerned with getting her a good marriage. He's about to get her a great marriage. The dream for every father. So for him to then suddenly be thinking about longer term consequences, especially at this stage, seems so at odds with what he's saying. So it makes a lot less sense as a comment on psychology. I say this, I'll repeat this because I think with the greatness of a move, a critical turn from the text to a deeper meaning, is when it makes sense of something that would not make sense otherwise. It doesn't make any sense. If you came to me, you said, please don't execute my son, and I said to you, you know, you're turning this into a scene from a farce, I think you'd have every right to just slap me in the face. Or, at the very least, since I am the king and you can't really do such a thing, show some discontent with how I'm handling your plight. But if I'm just saying something about the theater, then cool. In a way, it's really useful to learn. Yet another advantage is, how do we know? We don't really have Shakespeare essays on the art of theater making. He wasn't of that ilk, producing extensive commentary. So in a way, this is our best lead into his own thoughts about the theater, is the thoughts of other characters about theatrical moments and theatrical reactions and the experience of the theater in his own plays. It's the best access we get. And I think it's precious because it makes sense that great athletes are constantly interviewed about how they're doing certain things. And it makes sense that we would seek to interview Shakespeare on his own views. That we would kind of evaluate the art of the theater based on how Shakespeare is himself indicating that he would evaluate it. Indicating. We don't really know that he thought these things. But I suspect, since that's the only way that they make sense in some of these cases. Alright, thank you, and this has been the meta move. Probably my favorite move, though really difficult to execute. Really difficult to move that far away. Especially if you don't know theatrical conventions or poetic conventions, because this move also has, like a game, it has an expansion version. And the expansion version is a writer tells you about, narrates the story of a character going in a car, driving in a car. And it's a comment on the way the narrative drives. Very often, there's claims that the introduction of rails, the railway in the 19th century, and train rides, changed the concept of time, and they changed the concept of narrative. And in a way that seeing these train rides is a chance for the writer to comment on his own narrative speeding up. And some writers do. Literally make an analogy between storytelling and train rides. And that's pretty distant, right? You wouldn't necessarily think of a story being told as a train ride. So there's a lot of potential for, this is a metaphor for writing. No, this is a metaphor for writing. This is a metaphor for writing. Especially because writing is such a holy grail concept of so many things could be said about writing. Okay. Thank you so much for listening, viewing. If you're doing this the way I do it with podcasts, sleeping to the sound of my voice. And good night. There's always the awkward stop screen.